주변국들의 전략을 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 네, 2부 회의의 사회는 김호석 교수님께서 맡아주시겠습니다. 김호석 교수님께서는 미시간 대학교에서 정치학 박사학위를 받으시고 현재 중앙대학교 정치국제학과 교수로 재직 중이십니다. 그럼 2부 회의를 시작하도록 하겠습니다.
Thank you. My name is Hosok Kim, and a professor at Chung University. And I'd like to express my appreciation to EAI for organizing this conference about a very important topic, new security order in East Asia and ROK-US alliance. I'm a moderator of the second session, and the topic of the session is the rise of China and the strategy of neighboring countries. And rise of China, as you know, and how to deal with it is the main point of thinking about the new security order in East Asia. In the morning session, and hearing and listening to 3 presentations and discussions about the change in East Asian security architecture, we are enlightened and learned a lot about a new security order in East Asia. And based on the morning session presentation and discussion, I hope this session as well will bring about and raise new ideas and discussions as much as possible. And we have 3 presentations, and one from Japanese scholar, and one from the Indian scholar, and one from Taiwan scholars. And we have 3 discussants, and 2 of them are my colleagues from Chung University, and Professor Kim Tae-yeon and Professor Seung-Ju Lee. And third discussant is Ina Chang, Professor Nam Chang-hee, and he's Ina University professor. So let me begin with the Japanese presentation. And the presenter is Dr. Masayuki Masuda, and he is a member of the National Institute for Defense Studies under Japan's Ministry of Defense. And he is mainly responsible for study and education on China security and foreign policy. And please.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I'm Masayuki Masuda from NICS. As for the whole, the team introduced me that I'm now in charge with the study of Chinese security, mainly focusing on Chinese security policy and implication to the Japanese national interest. And in recent years, I have a lot of chance to test my views on the Japan's response to the rise of China. But unfortunately, I'm a specialist on Japanese policy itself. But as a China scholar, I'm always requested to how Japan see the power projection of the economic power and military power of China in, for example, in the year 2010 and 2030. Based upon this requirement, I studied quite a lot about the projection data of the China's national comprehensive power, together with my colleagues at the NICS. I also invited some friends together with at the Tokyo Foundation. Today's presentation is based upon the recent research project under the, not my institute, under the Tokyo Foundation. As already mentioned in the morning session, with the rise of China and other emerging powers, including India, Russia, Brazil, so-called BRICS countries, and the next 11 nations, international order is now bound for the structural change. The center of the gravity of global political and economy in coming decades is increasingly shifting from the so-called G7 framework to the emerging countries, where worldwide distribution of wealth will be highly diverse. One of the obvious driving force of this dynamic power shift is our neighboring country, China, of course. Last year, Japanese government published the new defense policy guidelines. In the guidelines, the Japanese government clearly mentioned that this trends of the global power shift by saying that global power shift is now apparent in this region, Asia Pacific. So Japanese policy leaders and politicians is now trying to grasp the trends of the power shift with the rise of China in the field of security strategy of Japan. This China's rise does not only change the bilateral and regional relations in Asia, but also its influence is going more global. The rise of China is both regional and global phenomenon that create new power relations and norms of the international society. For policymakers of Japan, there is an old-fashioned management based upon the more bilateral setting of the management of Japan-China relations have become obsolete. Accordingly, the Japan strategy toward China should be adjusted as the core of not just bilateral relations with Beijing. It should be adjusted as the core of Japan's whole of the regional strategy in Asia and the core of Japan's strategy towards the global emerging powers as a whole. The new strategy in Japan strategy can be defined as a design to achieve a specific objective by mobilizing power and resources in light of long-term perspectives. If you see my paper page, I think 86, there's a figure, Japan, U.S., China, nominal GDP outlook. In the year today, Chinese economy as a whole, size of the economy bigger than Japan. And also in the year 2020, the Chinese GDP would be double of the Japanese size. And also, according to our studies, China can catch up the United States, but in the year 2026. So Japan needs the new China strategy or security strategy as a more evolutionary concept, since present-day strategy cannot be worked in 5 or 10 years. So new strategy should be adjusted in reality in the year of 2020 or 2030. That requires the dynamic China strategy to serve the transition as a transition strategy based upon the possibilities of the power shift in these regions. Also, please look at the figure 2 on page 88. This figure is the military defense expenditures of Japan, United States, and China up to the 2030s. Today, China has got some double of the Japanese defense budget, and also in the year 2020, I think more than five times than that of Japan, and also in 2030, I think more than 10 times. So it's quite difficult for Japan, of course, for Korea, to catch up this Chinese military build up over in bilateral terms. So one of the reasonable outcome, reasonable policy is that, of course, we should seek more partners it's not hedging strategy, but it is very natural to seek a more defense or the security partnership with the regional countries such as Korea and ASEAN countries in the near future. Based upon these trends of the power shift, both economically and militarily, I think the Japan-China strategy should have the three pillars, three aims or functions. One is that the most important functions of the Japan strategy toward China is that integration or the accommodation with China. Of course, China, in the morning sessions, Professor Wang mentioned that China's increasing assertiveness or the background of the assertiveness in terms of domestic politics and nationalism or something. Yes, we should prepare to rise increasing assertiveness of Chinese military and security behavior in this region, but we cannot live without China's economy and China's influence in this region. So one most important function of the Japan and Koreans, of course Koreans, Chinese strategy is integration. The second pillar of the strategy would be diplomatic balancing. The third one is it's quite difficult to choose one single term, but in my paper I expressed the deterrence or the dynamic deterrence against sometimes China. That means that with the discussion about the integration functions, the taking as a premise for the medium to long-term trends of the China's rise. Also, in the long run, this rise will bring about a power shift, and that power balance may result in the form of sometimes U.S.-China parity. It's quite difficult to expect the parity in the capacity terms, but more image or the more imaginary world. It could be hard. It could be have a parity situation between the U.S. and China. Then it will be necessary that result of the parity or the power shift create a stable international order. From this perspective, Japan-China security relations will be required to have a more integrating functions or the accommodating function that expands the opportunity for cooperative action with China, not only bilateral terms, but also multilaterally as it includes the United States. The second pillar of the Japan's China policy or the strategy is diplomatic balancing. As I discussed in my paper, while these fields of regional cooperation where China's active involvement can be expected, especially in the field of economics and non-traditional security fields. But there are also the agenda such as preventive diplomacy and maritime security, in which China has been sometimes very negative to promote the cooperation. In these fields, China has not only simply refused to promote the cooperation in this region, but also shaped the direction and rules of the cooperation in ways that exclusively reflects its own preference. In other words, if we preserve today's system, or it's quite difficult to choose the term, preserve the decision-making process in the regional cooperation, that is ASEAN way, consensus, focus on the whole of the consensus. This situation, this system offered China to enjoy the veto power in the regional institutions. So Japan should now take a strong initiative in establishing the effective rules of the security cooperations, that the rules are not one-sidedly strengthening, that the rules are not one-sidedly shaped by China, but instead are formed so as to contribute to the strengthening of liberal international order, not China's narrow interest. So, in order to achieve this, it is necessary for Japan to take a new approach to the regional cooperation in Asia. In the area where China hampers the progress of the regional cooperation, Japan should build a coalition of the brilliance in the regional institutions. With the other active states such as Indonesia and the Philippines or sometimes Vietnam, we should build a coalition of the brilliance to promote practical cooperation in these fields. Of course, I choose the term balancing, but this balancing is not a hard balancing, kind of soft balancing or the institutional balancing or diplomatic balancing. If we can progress the regional security cooperation based upon the coalition of the brilliance, of course, next steps, we should always open the door to China to join the new rules of the corporations. The third function of the Japan-China security strategy, Japan's China security strategy is the crisis management or dynamic deterrence. As I mentioned, there's a very big possibility to have a power balance, a shift of the power shifts. But regardless whether the rise of China will lead to the great power transition in the system, there are additional functions that Japan should pursue in the security relations with China. This is the crisis management or dynamic deterrence. With the modernization of the Chinese military power, particularly expansion of the China's naval power and air force power, as well power and operations, the possibility that an accidental incident could occur between Japan and China on the sea and in the air has become undeniable. So last April, my institute published a new annual report mainly on China. The title is NIDS China Security Report. This report clearly mentioned that we should strengthen the communication and in order to build a crisis management mechanism between the SDF and Chinese PLA. The other element of this story is that dynamic deterrence. This is a new term for the Japanese security policy. Japan's new defense guidelines introduced this concept based upon the Japanese recognition of the Chinese military power. You know, as I mentioned, Chinese naval operations always expanded to the Pacific Oceans from East China Sea or from South China Sea. So we should watch and we should have a close watch on the Chinese naval operations in the surrounding waters by strengthening the surveillance activities and surveillance activity by the Japanese self-defense forces. Of course, dynamic deterrence has got another meaning. We are now living in peace times, no great war, but we have another occasional issues such as disaster or some other things. So Japanese government is now calling this not fully peace, but not peacetime, but not wartime, just gray zone all the times. So in order to deal with these gray zone situations, times, we should always be ready for Japanese SDF and militaries to operate in the field of disaster relief activities, not only in Japan but also in this region. This is another aspect of dynamic deterrence. I think that the time has come. I'll stop here. I'm looking forward to have a comment and criticism and questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Professor Masuda, in his presentation, seemed to interpret the rise of China mainly in terms of the security perspective. And he suggested three options of Japanese strategy to the rise of China. And let us expect interesting discussion about his perspective and his suggested option actually to China by the designated commentator. And let's come to the second presentation by the Professor Ming Lee about the Taiwanese strategy to the rise of China. And Professor Ming Lee is in the Department of Diplomacy and director of the Center for Korean Studies and National Cheongchi University, 국립정치대, I think, in Taiwan. Please.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Kim, the chairperson of this session. Well, good afternoon, and also 下午好, and konnichiwa, 안녕하십니까? 저는 국립정치대학교 외교학과 교수입니다. 반갑습니다. I feel very happy to be here. Whenever I come here, I always think that I'm like coming home. So I will also take this a very precious and great opportunity to meet with my old friends and also build upon a new friendship with the new friends. So thank you very much for the EAI's invitation. And I think this is a great honor and a very, very great pleasure for me. As a professor teaching at the 정치대학교, the Tsinghua University, once upon a time, it's not so long ago, I asked some of my friends, actually I asked my international kind of friends and also professor over there, how do you think China is a threat or an opportunity? And you say, well, they told me both. As I asked my students taking my course of international relations, and how do you think that China is a threat or opportunity? And I said, well, raise your hand if you see Chinese regime as a threat. And I think 90% of the students raised their hands. And how do you think about what China is an opportunity? And same numbers, possibly same numbers of the students raise their hands. And to my conclusion that, China, the rising China is both threat and also opportunity to Taiwan. And I would say that there's no nation at all in the world will be so alert, will be so feeling kind of threatening by the PRC. Because there's only one very, very narrow kind of Taiwan Strait in between us. And I would like to tell you another story. When I was teaching an international course called the Mainland China's International Relations, I asked my students, do you know the difference in between the two pairs of divided rivals, that is North and South Korea, and China and Taiwan? And some of them told me that, well, yes, we can see the difference, because there's a DMZ on the Korean Peninsula, but there's a Taiwan Strait in between Taiwan and mainland China. And also Taiwan is so small, and China is very big. And I said, well, you are right. But still, I'm going to add some more thing, is that, you can still find a very, very strong atmosphere of a confrontation on the Korean Peninsula. But right now, you can see the atmosphere or environment of conciliation in between Taiwan and mainland China. So, the kind of environment has been changing right now. My paper, I would say, I try very hard to make some kind of introduction as a brief history that for those friends that they are not so acknowledgeable to the cross-strait Taiwan relations. And secondly, I'm going to focus on the domestic situation or domestic kind of a policy in Taiwan, vis-a-vis the mainland China. And thirdly, I'm going to focus on also a very, very severe kind of a confrontation, even in Taiwan itself. We can see that the ruling and the opposition parties in Taiwan are so different in their policy vis-a-vis mainland China. The ruling party, the KMT, the Kuomintang, is much more conciliatory to the mainland China, because the KMT knows that it is the time, for the Taiwan government to adopt a changing policy, if compared with the last 8 years or about 12 years of the former President Lee, Lee Teng-hui, and DPP's Mr. Chen Shui-bian's ruling. But the DPP as the opposition party in Taiwan still keeps a very, very kind of a rigid policy that they still very strongly stress the necessity to have a tough kind of policy vis-a-vis China. So what I'm mentioning is that even in Taiwan, really hardly can we find the consensus in between the ruling as well as the opposition parties, and some of the people are struggling against each other. And if you like, you can go to Taipei, that they are having a lot of kind of arguments, especially prior to the January 14 of 2012. Well, that was the date of the next presidential election. So we can still find some kind of very, very diversified arguments where to go. The Taiwanese kind of policy vis-a-vis mainland China. And then I'm going to talk about the American factor, and which I show the American factor is very, very important in, which is decisive in the future cross-strait relations. And then I'm going to tell you the perception of mainland China to see, how China is going to perceive Taiwan and how China is going to adopt the kind of Taiwan policy. And then I make my conclusion. The time is so short. I would say that the kind of bilateral ties in between the Taiwan Straits and the mainland China has passed and has experienced kind of many decades of animosity. But from the March of from the May of 2008, when Ma Ying-jeou took power, he made a different kind of policy vis-a-vis mainland China, as we know. You can see from the newspaper and the many other broadcasting kind of news that he tried to make a kind of pragmatic policy vis-a-vis mainland China. And his policy would be focused on the no unification, no independence, and no use of force. And I think this is the one of the many backbones that you can find from Ma Ying-jeou's government. President Ma has reiterated the backbone of his mainland policy is what I said: no unification, no independence, no use of force. But in addition to this, he also stressed the need to broaden the international participation of Taiwan, and also, try to broaden, Taiwan's kind of international relations with others. But still, keeps very alert on the rising power of mainland China, particularly the increasing expenditure in military forces, and also its rising kind of presence, especially military presence against Taiwan. As we know that there is more than 1,000 missiles would be targeted on Taiwan and some other Pacific targets. So still, we think it is still necessary for Taiwan to augment its military especially defensive weapon, so as to purchase more from the United States. But this is adding some kind of complicated relations vis-a-vis mainland China. But I would like to say one of the big developments in between Taiwan and China has been the ECFA, the Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement that's signed last June. This will be a very useful kind of footstep for the further improvement, of the relations in between Taiwan and mainland China. But still, we really have to go further to see whether if this kind of policy would be still stated, because as I mentioned earlier, we're going to have a presidential election in next January. I think the date will be the January the 14th. So although some people would say, Ma Ying-jeou, enjoyed a very high rate of kind of endorsement or support, but still, some of the people in Taiwan would think that whether if they will have a female president in the future, because the DPP's candidate is the Ms. Tsai Ing-wen. So it's everything is possible, but we still would like to know what will happen in the future. But I myself will hope that the cross-strait relations in the future will keep on going smoothly. And I think actually you can find some other materials and also arguments on my paper. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lee. And he analyzed, I think, the influence of China upon domestic politics of Taiwan and current President Ma-induced policy toward China and the recent bilateral relations between China and Taiwan. And let us expect the more interesting discussions on the presentations. And let's turn to the third presentation. And it is a perspective from the India, and I think it is beneficial to include the Indian perspective to think about the new security order in East Asia and rise of China. And presenter is Ms. Anumita Rao, and she is a research analyst with the Strategic Foresight Group, a think tank that works on global issues in India. Please.
Thank you, Chairperson. I'd first like to thank East Asia Institute, and I'd like to compliment its staff on an excellent conference so far. So I've been asked to speak about India's strategy towards China. I thought the easiest way to do that would be to split it chronologically. I'm going to begin by giving you a short historical perspective, and then discuss the status quo in terms of avenues of conflict as well as avenues of cooperation between the two countries, and then a short, brief discussion on what the future might look like. Historically, India and China began their diplomatic relations in 1950, and around the same time they signed what is now known as the Panchashila Agreement, which literally translates into 5 principles. It's interesting to look at the principles because they include tenets such as mutual non-interference, mutual non-aggression. If you have any idea of what India's foreign policy would become in the 60s, this is basically the beginnings of the non-aligned movement. Unfortunately for both countries, territorial disputes got in the way, and by 1962 they had a full-fledged war. Relations between the two countries remained tense, especially as China began to support Pakistan as well as the fledgling Naxalite movement in India. In 1987, once again, the two countries almost came to the level of military confrontation, but backed away very quickly due to back-channel negotiations. Since then, both countries have strived really hard to stay away from a potential military conflict. 1990s is really when India's relationship with China begins as we see it today. With the exception of 1998, when we tested our first nuclear missile, the relationship has really been growing since then. Historically, India's strategy towards China has been reactive, because such a significant percentage of our foreign policy thinking was directed towards Pakistan. there was very little consideration given to AIs in China. I think that is beginning to shift now. As a result, China, as a prime mover, has retained some amount of advantage in its relations with China historically. However, given India's ambitions on the global stage in the last few years, I think this is likely to change. In terms of status quo, like Dr. O'Hanlon mentioned this morning, India and China have a very multifaceted, complex relationship. There is fundamental cooperation on many, many levels, but there is also competition and conflict over others. Simply speaking, in terms of trade, they have an extremely robust relationship that is growing leaps and bounds annually. They do, I think, about $60 billion worth of trade at present, but India imports much more than it exports to China, so it's a bit of a lopsided relationship at present. In terms of avenues of conflict, I have decided not to go very deeply into several. There are very many, including the territorial disputes that we have over Aksai Chin and Arunachal Pradesh. I have instead looked at 3 specific areas of conflict: influence, resources, and Pakistan. I'll begin with influence. China, as a part of its string of pearls strategy, is expanding aggressively in South Asia. String of pearls basically involves them increasing their geopolitical influence in terms of various ports alongside South Asia. So they have ports in Pakistan, in Burma, in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka. This is a worrisome strategy for India, simply because it's sort of being choked off literally right now. If China were to act, it would be choked off. So India's counter strategy in this regard has been to expand its own influence in Southeast Asia through its Look-East policy. In terms of its Look-East policy, it's really looked to engage ASEAN as an organization much more closely, as well as individual countries. In this regard, military and especially naval ties have expanded considerably, including with South Korea, but also with Vietnam, with the Philippines, with Thailand, Indonesia, and Japan, as well as Australia. Obviously, trade ties between India and Southeast Asia are extremely strong right now and can be expected to continue that way for the next few years. Strategically speaking, in terms of India, it is in our interest to maintain close ties with Southeast Asia, not just in order to counterbalance China, but also for our own global position in the next few years. Moving on to resources, I think India and China have a resource war on several fronts right now, but I think it's being extremely played out right now in Africa. Both China and India have considerable investment in Africa. China has about $110 billion as of 2008, whereas India has less than half of that as of 2010. While China has invested extensively in oil, in acquiring large tracts of land to grow foodstuffs for its population, India has looked more towards developmental projects and also developing the human resources potential of Africa. In the long term, this particular strategy is more likely to pay off for India just because it's looking to create a more strong Africa through its involvement there. Moving on then to Pakistan. This is possibly of greatest strategic concern to India right now. China is heavily involved in Pakistan, especially in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, or POK. China has also supplies much of Pakistan's military strength right now. In terms of POK, China has close to 9,000 troops in the area, as well as has investments in water and energy-based projects, specifically the Neelam Jhelum project, the Diamond Basha, and the Bunji project, all of which have strategic concern for India. Also, China has recently completed the Gwadar port, which is one of the pearls on its string of pearls in Balochistan. For China, I think Pakistan is being used as an entry point to Central Asia and the Middle East. Whereas for Pakistan right now, given its deteriorating relations with the US, China is just an extremely important ally, possibly the most important ally right now. So the relationship between China and Pakistan is a bit lopsided. Hussein Haqqani, who was the former Pakistani ambassador to the US, said that for Pakistan, China is a high-value guarantor of security against India, whereas for China, Pakistan is a low-cost deterrent to India. I think this is somewhat accurate, except now for Pakistan, China is a high-value guarantor against both India and the United States. However, it's important to note that China, while has supplied military power and is investing in water projects and oil, is not very interested in taking on a strong stance on the global stage on behalf of Pakistan. It hasn't done so in the past and is unlikely to do so in the coming few years. For India, this is an extremely worrisome development, just because any action taken in Pakistan or by Kashmir or for that matter Pakistan is a direct strategic concern to New Delhi. However, despite increased irritation on India's part with China's involvement in Pakistan, they have not made any declarative sentences. They have not taken any concrete action thus far. But that might change given an extreme provocation. I want to discuss also avenues of cooperation, just because when India and China discuss, there's a lot of, especially in India, media coverage that is very negative, that constantly pits the two countries against each other, whereas they do cooperate extensively. To begin with, on climate change, the two countries have extensive cooperation. In 2010, before the Copenhagen conference, they signed a memorandum to cooperate on energy conservation, efficiency, renewable energy, and forest management. They both want to sort of allay Western fears that they will not reduce their GHG emissions. So this is one way for them to show them, one way for them to cooperate. They also have rivers such as the Brahmaputra and other Himalayan-based rivers that are being directly impacted by climate change. So for them to cooperate is in both their interest and is likely to happen over the next few years. They've also taken joint stances for developing countries on the international stage. I think that has happened quite a few times over the last couple of years and is likely to increase. Examples include WTO talks in Doha. In 2010, China supported India against the EU on seizure of generic drugs. Also Copenhagen, where they both took joint stances. They also belong to joint voting blocs like BRIC and BASIC. So wherever their interests intersect in the next few years, they are likely to take joint stances. In terms of terrorism, the two countries have a lot of potential to cooperate but have not done so far. There's been a lot of discussion, there are a lot of statements out there saying that we must cooperate, we will cooperate, but it has not happened. In particular, the ETIM, which is the East Turkestan Islamic movement in China, is gaining some momentum and has linked up with groups including the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, the Haqqani network, and Al-Qaeda. So if this particular threat grows, there is a lot of potential for China and India to cooperate over this particular matter. In terms of the future, I think it's possible that India suddenly becomes more aggressive. I think this is a possibility, but not a high probability. If India was to become more aggressive, it would have to have a rapid escalation in its economic growth. It would have to have overt support from Western countries. It would have to also have a diametrically opposite thinking in its foreign policy mechanism right now. Much of the old guard from the non-aligned movement days are still in charge at the foreign ministries. But this is not likely to happen just because of all of these factors coming together is not possible, at least for the next 5 to 10 years. On the other hand, India becoming more assertive with its decision-making vis-a-vis China, that is likely to happen, and we already have some evidence of that. For example, India drilling in the South China Sea along with Vietnam, I think that is an example of how India is willing to be more assertive in response to Chinese actions such as issuing staple visas to people from Kashmir. I think India has also started to take more decisive actions like suspending military relations with China on specific issues. I think in 2011, China refused to issue a visa to an Indian lieutenant general who was from Kashmir. India then ended up summarily completely dismissing the entire exercise with China, which it might not have done so 20 years ago. So I think it also depends on what happens in the next election in India in 2014, depends on who comes into power. If it is the younger guard, then I think it's more likely that we will see much more assertive actions from India vis-a-vis China. But in conclusion, I think I'd like to say that India's strategy towards China is still evolving. It is not completely evolved yet. So I think there's a lot of room to maneuver there. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita. And in her presentation, she analyzed relationship between India and China in historical perspective. And according to her, it has been a mixture of the two paths of relationship. One path is conflict and the other path is cooperation. And she draws the future scenarios of India to China. Thank you very much. And let me turn to the discussion. And I think there is designated. So please, the Professor Nam Chang-hee, he seems to be dedicated to discussion with the Japanese perspective. And Professor Nam is a professor of Department of Political Science, School of Social Science, Geneva University. Please.
Thank you, Chairman. The Chairman has just told me that I have plenty of time to discuss Professor Masuda's paper, which is very rare in this kind of meeting. I teach international relations at a university located close to international airport. And I also served in the university as Vice Dean of Grad School. Recently, I find the number of Chinese students are rapidly increasing in every university in this country. Maybe same thing should be happening in other countries. This is also an indicator of rise of China. And before I come to this room, I took a walk in Myeongdong, because I have about 1 hour after lunch. And I found that the large number of Chinese tourists are replacing Japanese tourists in the shopping center of Seoul. That also shows that China is on the rise. And the good news is that, this could be a kind of blessing for you all that we are together here in Seoul, because I think Korea is most experienced in dealing with rising China. Why? Because Korea is very much close to China, and we have got along with for like 4,000 years. Sometimes China was on the rise. Sometimes China was disintegrated. So we know how to deal with China, rising China. So it is good that you are here, especially from Taipei, Japan, and India, to discuss this very much issue of rise of China with Koreans. Well, let me first briefly address how I felt with the presentation made by Professor Masuda. It is indeed a detailed description of the three choices he outlined in Japan's foreign policy options in Japan's effort to deal with rising China. He introduced accommodation first, or integration, secondly, dynamic deterrence, and thirdly, diplomatic balancing, which are all well taken, I think. These are all three major phases of calculation probably Japan is contemplating to deal with rising China, I think. So it was very much informative and useful to understand what Japan is thinking about when it faces increasingly assertive Chinese, for example, maritime activities in East China Sea, or what we observed last year, Senkaku Daiyotao incident last year. Maybe I can briefly note that the basic approach or theoretical or philosophical thinking behind his analysis probably is based on structural realism. He mostly looked at the distribution of power, defined as wealth and military power. But he rarely looked into the domestic characteristics of a polity or at the national level. China is on the rise, but China is not a democracy. So, but yesterday we saw that Mr. Gaddafi or Colonel Gaddafi was shot and beaten dead, and that also shows us that the whole world is taking the road to democratization. China is not an exception, I think, but China is not yet a democracy. So what we are dealing with is rising China, which is in the process of democratization. So I'd like to suggest him to probably to also take into account that this aspect also into account. If so, I think probably he might put more emphasis on how to effectively form a coalition of willing among democracies. Well, my major point is China is definitely on the rise, and because of that, I think China is on the crossroad. The one road or one path is to become a democratic and responsible stakeholder. The second path China might take is as a monistic spoiler, aiming at becoming a regional hegemon, using those military doctrine like A2AD or other approaches China is contemplating today. So our problem or our collective objective is how to induce Beijing to take the first path other than the second one. So how to cultivate China to become a responsible stakeholder other than as a monistic spoiler. That is serve all the interest of all parties, not only in this part of the world but the whole world, I guess. So the method I might propose is that this has been my study for a fairly long time, but I was thinking of proposing U.S. Japan Korea security cooperation, and then combine it with Korea, China, Japan economic cooperation. So we promote simultaneously these two trilateral cooperation. One is for security and the other for economic cooperation. By doing so, I thought we can successfully induce China to take the first path. And this has been one of the policy platforms taken by President Lee Myung-bak's security advisory team, I thought. And this is written this is documented in the Blue House's foreign policy plan. So to make it short, how you would respond to this kind of Korea's official platform to deal with rise of China. In a way, it best serves interest of all parties involved. Do I have more time?
Oh, you have more time.
Okay. Yes. I have plenty of time. I'd like to. Yes. But the second one is more important. I have many friends in Japan and Tokyo, and sometimes when I have discussion over Korea's long-term foreign policy orientation, including especially vis-a-vis rising China. They often, I mean, my Japanese friends often ask me whether which way Korea is more interested between balancing and bandwagoning. I think most of you are familiar with these two terms, balancing and bandwagoning. But my Japanese friends sometimes are worried that Korea might take bandwagoning with China, because they remember Korea was kind of tributary country in the Xenocentric East Asian world order during the Joseon period. And I often found that was deeply embedded concerns among Japanese security specialists. But I flatly denied that Korea might take the similar road again, because we have alternative alliance like the U.S. and even Japan. In Joseon period, we didn't have alternative. Probably balancing will be Korea's policy option rather than bandwagoning to deal with rising China. But here again, I want to ask how you feel about this question, because this is important also to Japan. If Korea takes bandwagon approach to rising China, then Japan might be in trouble. So I mean, assuring you that there is no chance Korea to take bandwagoning approach to rising China. What do you think about this issue? If I may have time, I can even go back to the history of centuries ago. In the 4th AD and between the 4th AD and 7th AD, East Asia was in turmoil. I mean, and at the same time there was rising China, Zui or Su and Tang in China. We had a very much dynamic international relations period in East Asia. During the time, Baekje dynasty and Goguryeo Empire took balancing approach. They allied together to deal with rising China. The Shilla took bandwagoning approach. The smallest Shilla had no other option. See, it opened a bandwagoning approach initiated by a leading political figure whose name was Kim Chun-chu. So the story ends that balancing of Baekje and Goguryeo was failing, but if Shilla was not taking a bandwagoning, probably there was no chance that Tang could prevail on the Korean Peninsula. So my point is that Korea has a large number of experiences and of its very much sophisticated experiences to how to deal with the very much important issue of rising China. So let me conclude my question, conclude my comment by asking you to respond to two questions of mine. Thank you.
Okay. Professor Nam seems to point out Korea's basic position in approaching China, which is different from Japan, at least. And it is not a positive response to Mr. Masuda's suggestion for deeper security cooperation between Japan and Korea. If there is something in your side, then I'll give you a translator. Okay. And next commentator is Professor Seung-Ju Lee. He is a professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations at Chuang University, where I'm working at the same time. And Professor Lee is supposed to comment about the Taiwan's strategy. Please.
Thank you, Professor Kim. And I also would like to thank EAI for inviting me to this very interesting conference. And actually, this year I was invited to two conferences held in Taipei. And the main theme of the conferences was the rise of China, which is a buzzword these days. And then actually Professor Li Ming and I attended the same conference once. And another conference was entitled Living with Giants. And the experts and scholars from South Korea, Taiwan, and Canada were invited to that conference because like those countries share some concerns in common how to deal with giant or multiple giants. And in that sense, I think particularly South Korea and Taiwan have some concerns in common in dealing with not just China, but also the United States and other, like the regional major power, Japan. And then in that sense, I think I learned a lot by reading Professor Li Ming's paper, particularly from the Taiwan's perspective about how to deal with China, which is a very important topic these days. And actually, I have several questions and comments about Professor Li Ming's paper. I think the rise of China presents challenges as well as opportunities to most of East Asian countries, and because China has rapidly expanded its influence in the region, both economically as well as diplomatically. For example, in economic terms, East Asian countries gravitate into the China's economic power, and then at the same time, China rose or emerged as a kind of an economic powerhouse in East Asia. And particularly since the outbreak of the global financial crisis, East Asian countries' trade dependence on China has dramatically increased. I think that in a sense, it is a very good opportunity because China is a booming market, but on the other hand, it's not good. Or sometimes it could be a potential source of problem because we have most of the East Asian countries have a kind of asymmetric interdependence between China and East Asian countries. I think that in that sense, the rise of China is on the one hand opportunity, on the other hand is challenging. So how to deal with that kind of opportunity as well as challenge would be a kind of common problem we are currently facing these days. And then I think Taiwan has the same dilemma as well. And I think in terms of diplomacy, I think as you know, like China has put tremendous effort to assure its kind of peaceful rise in the region by launching counteroffensive for the last 10 years, like saying. And I think that because China ASEAN FTA is a kind of good case in point, as like China was kind of generous enough to offer early harvest programs to conclude an FTA with the Southeast Asian countries. I think that kind of like a context puts a kind of Taiwan in a very top position in terms of the diplomatic ties with the East Asian countries. So in that sense, I would like to ask Professor Li Ming, then like how does Taiwan get out of this kind of diplomatic isolation, given the context of the rise of China, and then as well as that kind of a diplomatic isolation or deteriorating condition is very much likely to continue in the coming years. So how to deal with, how to address this kind of diplomatic setback? That is one of the questions I would like to ask. And the second issue is about the impact of political changes on Taiwan's strategy in dealing with China. I think Professor Li Ming has a very nice illustration about the impact of political change, domestic political change, particularly political leadership change on Taiwan's policy in coming up with China policy. I think Professor Living's paper has a very detailed information about that kind of like drastic change from previous Chen Shui-bian government's China policy toward the current President Mai's policy. And I think the Chen Shui-bian's policy has been much more focused on the independence, Taiwan's independence, and then current President Ma has shifted the policy of conciliation. That kind of like a drastic policy change has been taking place in Taiwan. I think, in a sense, that kind of drastic policy change is inevitable and also understandable because, like, somehow domestic politics will put great pressure on the political leadership. That is understandable. But in terms of policy coherence or consistency, that may not be good. Well, that may be a kind of like a source of problem because like that's sending a wrong signal to the outside world in terms of the policy coherence, I think. So you mean like the drastic change from one extreme to another is not a good sign of like in terms of policy changes. So I think that is one of the big issues in the current Taiwanese politics. So the question I would like to ask is that whether or not this kind of pattern of like drastic changes will continue in coming years, particularly after the next presidential election, which is scheduled next year. That is, my hunch is that the economic stake between Taiwan and China has increased very rapidly for the last several years, particularly under the President Ma's government. So I think that kind of economic changes have created some kind of like interest groups or like business interests who benefited a lot from that kind of like exchanges. And I think in terms of the perspective of the constituent politics, like that kind of like conciliatory policy may generate like some kind of like built-in interest, like a big stake in the Taiwanese society. Those people is likely to continue, is likely to like support the current conciliatory policy of the current regime. I think in the coming years, like those business interests may be much more tightly integrated or incorporated into the Taiwan's China policy. So I would like to hear more about Professor Living's view about this issue. And my third point is the long-term efficacy of the President Ma's conciliatory policy. I think President Ma's conciliatory policy produced quite meaningful changes and reducing tensions in cross-strait relations. But, like as I said earlier, China has launched a kind of charm offensive, and I think China has been kind of like pretty much conciliatory in dealing with Taiwan as well. But if we look at the like last couple of years development of regional affairs, China has become much more assertive in dealing with regional affairs, like the conflicts and controversies with Japan, Vietnam, and South Korea. I think exemplifies this possibility. I mean, from the China's perspective, there is always a possibility of policy reversal in dealing with Taiwan. So, having said that, given that asymmetric relationship will make Taiwan much more vulnerable than the other way around. And I think is this conciliatory policy sustainable in the long term? There is another related question is that how to manage such asymmetric interdependence to guarantee Taiwan's long-term prosperity and survival. Another related question is that, from the Taiwan's perspective, how to induce China to stick with the current policy? What would be the China's strategy, inducing China to do that? And then another related question is, what would be the fallback strategy of the Taiwan's current conciliatory policy if it fails to induce China to stick with the current policy? Those are the kind of multiple and the related questions. And my fourth point is about the role of the United States. I think the United States has been a kind of pivotal player that has greatly influenced the cross-strait relations for the several decades. But I think it is time for Taiwan to think about the fundamental or profound reconfiguration of its relationship with the United States. I think this is very important because recently the United States claimed to be a kind of Asia-Pacific power to design or redesign the institutional architecture in the Asia-Pacific region. I think in that sense, Taiwan has some room for maneuvering to kind of reconfigure or reformulate its policy toward the United States. So I'd like to hear a little bit about this point from Professor Lim Ming. And my last point is the South Taiwan's kind of like a soft balancing strategy. I think, of course, Taiwan can think of several strategies in dealing with China. But I think reliance on the hard balancing strategy is not simply an option for Taiwan. Of course, you can increase or you can build up military might or military forces, but you cannot rely on that such a strategy at all. That should not be only one strategy from the perspective of Taiwan. I think another possibility or another strategy would be a kind of soft balancing strategy, which is geared towards kind of creating or nurturing common values or common identities in East Asia. And I think it is time for Taiwan to contemplate such a soft balancing strategy. And then I think if East Asian countries, including Taiwan, share those common values and common identities, and then China is much less likely to be assertive and antagonizing East Asian countries. And then what I would like to know is that what kind of diplomatic efforts Taiwan has put in building up that kind of like a soft balancing strategy. Those are my questions. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Professor Seung-Joo Lee raised very interesting and very important issues. At least 5 issues, I think. And first one is rising China, taking on rising China as challenges as well as opportunities. And second issue is the domestic politics of Taiwan and its influence on Taiwanese policy to China. And third issue is President Ma Ying-jeou's policy toward China. And fourth issue is U.S. role in the bilateral relations between China and Taiwan. And fifth issue is the soft balancing policy of Taiwan. And those are very important and interesting issues, and I'm expecting Professor Lee's response later. Third commentator will be Professor Tae-hyun Kim, and Tae-hyun Kim is a professor of international relations at Graduate School of International Studies and director of the Center for the Study of Grand Strategy at Jurong University, and he's a colleague also of my university. So, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for kind introduction. And this is a great honor for me to be a participant to an international conference of this magnitude and on a very timely subject. Last week, President Lee Myung-bak paid a state visit to the United States to commemorate a new chapter in the U.S.-Korea alliance, and I was bombarded by the media dealing with that summit. So, the theme of this section, the rise of China, is a very familiar one to everybody, maybe not just in Korea, but everywhere in the world. This year alone, I was invited to 5 or 6 conferences or seminars on this very subject, or the future U.S.-China relations. And the very next week, I'm supposed to present a paper in China on that particular issue. So because of that, I'm kind of tired of talking all these subjects, but in none of those seminars and conferences, I have seen a paper all from India. And so I'm very glad to have one to discuss at the last here. If I go on with Dr. Raj's paper and presentation, please allow me to reflect on some points around all these kind of discussions. At the very end of the Cold War, international relations scholars were very quick to note that a unipolar world with the United States as the only pole had finally come, but it was not going to last. Based on the balance of power theory, which is the theory in entire international relations discipline, Professor Waltz and Christopher Lane, among others, had predicted that a power or a coalition of powers will inevitably emerge to balance the power of the United States. They contended that it did not matter if US policy was threatening to other powers or not, because unbalanced power alone is threatening enough. But at the same time, they hinted that American foreign policy may probably turn threatening to other countries because there is no restraining power outside, like the role that played by the Soviet Union during the Cold War. In 10 years, such balancing acts, either individually or collectively, had not taken place. So in the year of 2000, Professor Kelsey Waltz conceded that balancing hasn't taken place yet, but still he contested that balancing would nevertheless take place, if not today, but tomorrow. But it was amazing that a balancing power against the tremendous power of the United States has really emerged since then to meet the prediction by the balance of power theorists. But it was more like predicted by, not by balance of power theorists, but by those power transition theorists like Paul Kennedy or ROK-US. That is the People's Republic of China. Not by any intentional act of balancing, but by the natural process of its own growth and by the relative decline of the US. China's GDP surpassed that of that of Japan to become the second largest economy in the world, and in the right track to surpass that of the US to become the biggest in 10 or 15 years. So over the years, China has spent proportionate or even disproportionately larger share of the growth to its military muscles, taking advantage of huge amounts of trade surpluses and its privileged portion as the permanent member of the United Nations. It has expanded its influence, both political and economic, around the world. But everybody knew that China was rising. But in this particular year, we had many conferences. I think that was probably influenced by more active, assertive, aggressive foreign policy actions by China last year. And they was very reactive, strongly reacting to the US-South Korean joint military exercise after the sinking of Chinese ships or bombing of the Indian Islands. They also had a military diplomat with military implication clashes with Japan and other countries. So now the question has shifted to not from who's gonna balance the power of the United States, but who's gonna balance the power of China. Just as powers have, right after the post-Cold War, other nations like Europeans, Chinese, Japanese, or Russians, whom Waltz predicted that the balanced US power had shrunk away from balancing US power, more like they bandwagoned it. And the same kind of phenomenon is taking place, probably, in the next few years, vis-a-vis China as well. So, many of the countries either try to bandwagon on the growing train of China's economy, or maybe pass the buck, if you use international relations jargon again, pass the buck, or pass the burden of balancing China to other nations. And on that kind of context, I think India is one of the natural candidates to balance the growing power of China. In terms of its civilization and history, territory, and the size of population, India is just comparable to China. They share borders over which they had long-standing disputes, to even military clash, and like China has, India has recorded the first economic growth to weigh heavily on the world market. In that regard, Dr. Raj and Mr. Raj already hinted that there has been growing clashes, probably diplomatic clashes between China and India over influences in around the neighboring areas, particularly South Asia and Southeast Asia. But she is very careful that it's not gonna be heading toward any kind of outright diplomatic or military confrontations, because there are many elements of common interest. So, given that, I would like to raise 3 questions to her. She was saying that the most important element of cooperation between China and India is growing economic ties between them. If that is the case, to what extent the growing economic ties between India and China are important to each other? I put the question another way. Is the growth of China and India economic ties is overpace the economic growth of China and India alone. I mean, let's say China is growing 9%, India is growing 8%, and the trade volume of India-China trade is growing at 10% or 15%. And if that is the case, then we can think that's a growing economic ties, and interdependence will play a very important restraining factor in that bilateral relations. And second question is, to what extent Indians perceive China's growing role in South Asian neighbors? They are extending their presences in Pakistan, first most of all, but Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh, which would have been traditionally regarded as a sphere of influence of India. There could be 2 ways of seeing them, perceiving those trends. One, they may be just a natural outgrowth of China's growth itself, although as a result it may be to the detriment of India's interests. Or there may be some element of China's intention to encroach upon India's sphere of influence on one hand, to make China as one of the great power in the world. At the other hand, a kind of preemptive or preventive movement against India from becoming a kind of competent matching power against China. What is is there any element? My question is whether there is an element of that kind of conspiracy in India's perspective. Another question is, now India is expanding its presence in Southeast Asia, which, if you remember, many of the Southeast Asian nations are placed in Indo-China Peninsula. That is the area where the Indian and Chinese influences can overlap traditionally. But India was a long time absent from that area while China was expanding its influence heavily there. And then recently India is expanding its influence into that region as well. So given that, I'll put the second question around to India. To what extent India's ROK-East policy, or extension to Southeast Asian nations, is the natural result of India's growth? Or whether to what extent is it reactive to China's encroachment to India's sphere of influence in South Asia? Or to what extent India's ROK-East policy was motivated by India-China rivalry or competition? And the last point I would like to ask is can you provide any kind of element or information that India is looking ahead? India's strategic thinking or planning in military side, how China factor is playing in the strategic planning, thinking more or less under the defense procurement, or military training, or military exchange with other nations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Kim. And he raised at least 4 questions. One is economic ties between India and China, sorry. And second question is about India's perception toward the Chinese assertive diplomacy in Indian Ocean. And fourth one is India's ROK-East policy into Southeast Asian region and Chinese involvement in the same region. And fourth question is the Chinese factor in the Indian foreign policy making. And let me give you a chance to respond. And so let me turn to the response period. And I'll give you first Professor Masuda, and then Professor Lee, and Ms. Anurita. Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Comment from Professor Nam Shahid. Yeah, Professor Nam mentioned that Korea, China, Japan, throughout corporations. Yeah, I completely agree that this is one of the good schemes for the engagement policy toward China. But today's my presentation is basically my focus is the security aspect of the corporations. I think that the South Korea, China, and Japan just had a meeting started in the year of 1999, I think. And then a few years ago, there's the first ever joint declaration referring to the defense cooperation. We should start defense cooperation among the armed forces and defense authorities. But so far, we don't have any particular cooperation among the defense authorities yet. So the main focus of the trade cooperation among Beijing, Tokyo, and Seoul is the economic and social issues, such as food security or some other issues. So it's still difficult to expect to have a more deep defense and security cooperation in this trade mechanism. So from Japanese perspective, one of the reasonable, another trade cooperation would be, security cooperation would be Tokyo, Seoul, and Washington. This trade cooperation is more reasonable for dealing with the non-trade security problems, such as humanitarian disaster, humanitarian assistance, and disaster relief. And the other one is Tokyo, Canberra, and Washington. These two schemes would be one of the basic options for Japanese security policy in order to expand the cooperation in this region. But in terms of, from the perspective of the China integrations, we should seek the more openness, or seek the pursue a framework, include China, based upon the alliance network alliance system, such as Korea, Japan, United States, and Japan, United States, and Australia. So I think, can I give a question to Korean friends? When we talk, one of the difficulties for Japanese security specialists and policy makers is that when we talk about the issues, regional security issues with the Korean friends and Korean expert defense authorities, when we share one word, region, or Northeast Asia, but when Korean specialists, Korean guys, friends talk about Northeast Asia, that's only Peninsula. For example, issue of the Taiwan Strait and the China issues, and especially security and military issues, they are a little bit reluctant to have a more in-depth dialogue between us. So I think today's session is very wonderful, talking about directly about China's rights know about terms, but also security and other terms. So my answer is not a direct answer to Professor Nam, but I'm sorry. I want to ask Jackie again. Is there any expectation for you to deepen our security and military cooperation in this region, Northeast Asia, beyond the peninsula? Professor Lee.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Kim, for your chairmanship, and I appreciate it very much. And I also would like to express my deep gratitude to Professor Yi Seung-ju for his very nice comments, and which I benefited a lot from his commentary. He raised a lot of questions. To my memory, it's almost 8. But the 8 questions will be very, very valuable for any possible revision in the future for my, for me to revise my paper if it's possible. But among these 8 questions or comments, actually there are 4 pairs. I would like to answer the questions very briefly. Well, there are at least two kinds of international isolation appeal, to Taiwan. We have political isolation. We are not the we are not a member of the United Nations, and we withdrew the United Nations in the year 1971, with China entered in, and also the possibly economic isolation. That we are not a member of what we call ASEAN +1 or ASEAN +3, but we are going to make a kind of conciliatory economic relations with China recently. As I mentioned earlier, we have ECFA signed by Beijing and Taipei already, and we can use ECFA as a very useful instrument to get Taiwan into the orbit of international economic cooperation. And actually, although we have only 23 countries still keep diplomatic ties with Taiwan, with the contrast, mainland China have more than 172. Yes, of course, we are not going to compare with China, and neither do we have the mentality to challenge the PRC in the international community, especially for winning more diplomatic ties. But still, we are going to negotiate with China to have more international kind of room for maneuver, for both sides of the Taiwan Straits. And I think we have already got some kind of reciprocation from mainland China already. And also, Professor Lee's question, domestic politics in Taiwan is very crucial for the future cross-strait relations. Yes, and he also mentioned whether if there could be any possibility that we will shift from this end to that end. In other words, Ma Ying-jeou is the president, and how come would the DPP will possibly win the next presidential election? Is there happen some kind of a pendulum, a kind of a pendulum effect? I would say that the people in Taiwan suffer from the last 8 years of unstable cross-strait relations. From the year 2000 to 2008. They learn much lesson. They learn a lot of lessons. So now they prefer to have a stable relations, in between the two sides of Taiwan Straits. According to the poll that made by the made by the Mainland Affairs Commission, more than 68% of the people would prefer to have a status quo. And what we call status quo is Ma Ying-jeou's policy of no unification, no independence, and no use of force. And I think this will be a kind of very special situation that could be supported by the most of the Taiwanese people. I think it is unlikely that the Taiwanese people will go, from this extreme to the other extreme. Well, I'm quite confident of this. But talk about the soft power that Taiwan is going to use. I think we are not going to compete with mainland China in hard power, especially in the military. There's no way that Taiwan is going to compete with China in military kind of terms. But talk about the soft power. After kind of Professor Joseph Nye's book, Born to Lead, everybody knows that how to differentiate into in between the soft and the hard power. Yes, we also know this, and so did the leaders in Beijing. So that from the early, I would say from the early 21st century, there have been more than 240 Confucius Institute has been built. And I think the first Confucius Institute was built in Seoul. But we are not going to build that same kind of thing. But I think we have, Taiwan has soft power that is very, very welcome, even to some people in the mainland. For example, we have open society. We are open society, and we have freedom of speech. We have freedom of expression, and we are not going to check, the people's kind of serving into the internet. And we are having a democratic system. So I think this will be the part of the soft powers that we are going to use. So we are not afraid of the a kind of challenge in the future, but we are not going to provoke anyone. And I think this is a kind of a stable policy that we're going to pursue in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. And I give you Professor Wang to have a comment to the Professor Lee later. And please.
First of all, thank you, Professor Kim, for your questions. They were quite excellent. With regards to economic ties, you asked me to what extent growing economic ties are important to each other vis-a-vis their own individual economic growth. I don't think their economic ties take precedence over their individual economic growth. But I think it is an important facet of bilateral relations between the two countries. It is the area on which they cooperate the most. But India-China bilateral relations are not even the same as China-Africa bilateral trade. So I don't think it takes precedence over individual growth of both these countries. You asked me to what extent Indians perceive China's growing influence in South Asia as a direct threat or direct intentional encroachment in India's sphere of influence vis-a-vis China's natural growth. I think especially given the media coverage, it is perceived very much as a direct intentional encroachment by China. And I think even as a strategy, it is somewhat related to containing India, especially China's relationship with both Pakistan and Nepal. I've worked extensively in water security for the last 3 years, and I'll give you an example. Nepal is an upper riparian country for India, and roughly 70% of the Ganges' water comes from Nepal. So it's an extremely important upper riparian for us. But China has invested heavily in hydropower in Nepal. This is a direct threat to India. But it's not accidental on China's part. They've invested roughly $200 million so far in hydropower in Nepal. And Nepal's hydropower, while considerable, is not the most vital factor for China investing there. Same thing with Pakistan. Investing in hydropower in contested waters between India and Pakistan is definitely intentional on China's part. So, especially with regards to Indian media coverage, this is very much viewed by the general public as an intentional encroachment. In terms of the Look-East policy, I think it's a mixture of both India's natural growth and its interest in its global ambitions, and also as a response to China. Just because the Look-East policy has existed for several decades, so there is renewed interest over the last 5-7 years. So that, I think, points to the fact that it's not simply to do with its interest in Southeast Asia, but also as a counterbalance to China. But it's important to note that India has ambitions globally as well, and this is a factor in that. So I think I would say that both of these are important. As for India's military strength, I'm not a military expert and I won't claim to be, but I think India's military procurement and strategy right now is sort of, our defense budget has increased rapidly in the last few years, and we're procuring large amounts of weaponry and machinery from other countries, including the US and Israel. But I think military strategy right now in India is still focused on containing Pakistan, and as well as on India's own domestic terrorism, specifically the Naxalite movement. So I think China might be a long-term thought, but it's not an immediate thought right now. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Then, President, will you respond to the Mr. Masuda's question and, about the concept of global station?
Yes, I please very briefly. Yes, Professor Masuda is right to say that whenever he meets with Korean counterparts, Koreans tend to be preoccupied with their imminent threat stemming from North Korea. We are shared last year, and one of our frigate ship was torpedoed. So that's a reality we face on the peninsula. Maybe because of that, many Korean security specialists and architects are preoccupied with North Korea. So because of that, we lack in that we do not have a broader perspective as you have in Japan. I should admit that, but there are a great number of security analysts in town who are willing to share ideas with Japanese and Chinese security specialists. In a way, we have a more broader definition of East Asia, as you pointed out. Thank you.
And let me open the session floor. First of all, I'd like to give a chance to Professor Wang from China. If I want to ask if he has a comment about the especially Taiwan's strategy to China.
Well, I think I'm not gonna stand between everyone and and the break. So I think I'm going to be very brief. I think what I enjoy very much, first of all, very much reading Professor Lee's essay, paper. I've learned a great deal. And personally, I would say I also understand the concerns that Professor Lee raises. So I think there are actually different scenarios if we go looking ahead at the prospects of cross-strait relations. So that was also what I was discussing with Professor Lee during the lunch. So depending on the upcoming election outcomes, I think if DPP wins, I think there are a lot of reasons for us to be concerned and even worried about cross-strait relations. But if, as I think most of the analysts now seems to be predicting that Ms. Ma Ying-jeou might be winning, presumably with a very narrow, with the same margin. If that is the case, then probably we ought to be more sort of optimistic about the future cross-strait relations. But still, I think there are a number of obstacles in the road, and we shouldn't be. I think we should be very forthright about them, including, I think, the question Professor Lee raised, the Taiwan's concern about international space. I think this is, as the mainland leaders has repeatedly also pointed out, Beijing, I think Chinese mainland leaders, they will be very much in understanding and trying to respond to the Taiwan's people's their need. I think this is a very, I think, so as long as, so most important thing is that as long as both sides has this very reasonable mutual trust, political trust. So that's another thing I think Professor Lee also pointed out in his paper why the 1992 consensus is so important, because this is really the cornerstone of the political trust across the street. So if everything goes right, I think then I think we ought to be seeing the further improvement in cross-strait relations, but it takes time, and I think patience is always very variable, and especially when it comes to cross-strait relations. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for giving me the chance.
It seems to me that relations between China and Taiwan is much more amicable than that of the North Korea and South Korea. And in the floor, is there any question or comments to the paper presenters and discussants also? Okay, Mr. Kim, please.
Thank you for the panel, for the very interesting discussion of the rise of China. Not very explicitly discussed is the timing of when, because China's rise, of course, is a continuing process, but nevertheless how fast is, I think, is a very relevant issue, because 10 years difference makes a big difference in the attitude of leadership. I find this thing in many nations, but particularly is very fast changing world like in Asia. I would see the leadership of China 20 years from now would take a different attitude than the leadership today in various issues, and therefore their strategy and neighbors' reaction to how to deal with it is very important. In that regard, one of the dangers right now I see there are, of course, something like year 2025 is about the crossing point a lot of people see. China overtaking US in the GDP, and soon followed by the overtaking of the military force, so on and so forth. But I see great danger in that, because as an economist, I see all those projections are based on the data coming from the past experiences. And when you look at China from catching up period into the area where they merge into the surge onto the leadership positions, is an entirely different world. And to use the past track record, although they are doing some moderations, I think I see intuitively all the projections are too optimistic in that regard. So I don't know whether I'm asking questions or comments, but I basically believe our thoughts of China's position of leading the world is a little further away than very often projected. Thank you.
Thank you. So you are not addressing particular presenters.
Comments will be appreciated, but no comments is fine.
Comments is very appreciated. In floors.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Could you please read online, and I will.
I see. Okay.
Receive them more,
Sure.
one or two comments.
Okay, sure.
So, floors. Okay. Professor Han is Vice President of the National Defense Academy.
Let me ask Ms. Raji about your security policy concern or deliberation of a future strategy. From Beijing's position, Pakistan is a right arm and North Korea is a left arm, and they are strengthening military ties, and also they are looking for inroad to the sea in acquiring Gwadar port in Pakistan and one in Najin in North Korea. And this kind of encirclement strategy could be seen by India, and you have to hedge against this kind of Chinese going to the sea, maritime strategy. Then India is now strengthening ties with the United States while strengthening cooperation with China. So, what is your future strategy in thinking about 20 years ahead? How to ensure your security and stability in South Asia?
Just a brief follow-up question to Dr. Raj. You have Regional Cooperation Organization, SAC. Haven't you discussed this topic, how to deal with Chinese approach to your area in the organization?
Are there any other questions or comments? Okay. Please introduce yourself, please.
First of all, thank you for uncommonly good presentations and vivid discussions. I am Captain Dong-Yeon Jo in ROK Army, and my question goes to Professor Masuda, Su-Yi, sorry. I think Republic of Korea and Japan has a lot of common in terms of U.S. alliance throughout the history, and dealing with the rise of China is a very important issue to both countries in terms of security and economic aspects. And my question, quick question is, when articulating the Japan security strategy toward China, U.S. factor, what aspects of U.S. factor do you think? So when dealing with the rise of China, to summarize my question again, what do you think the U.S. factor in terms of the Japan and U.S. Military alliance, how this alliance affects to deal with the rise of China?
I'll give you a chance to the paper presenters. First, Professor Lee, and then Ms. Nas, and last, Masuda, in that order.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairperson. I would like to express my deep gratitude to Professor Wang's comment. And I think even in mainland China, they are concerned about whether if Ma is going to be re-elected or not. Because if Ma should not be re-elected, the current mainland policy will be in a very, very big shift. So that I'll be a little bit optimistic about Ma's being elected, but still, nothing could be guaranteed, because as we can remember that, the DPP candidate, Mr. Chen Shui-bian, when he was trying to get re-elected in the year 2004, they happened to have two magic bullets, two magic bullets, so Mr. Chen re-elected. But I'm a little bit optimistic about the election in the 2012, and I think hopefully the interflow of and also the inter-exchange in between the two sides of Taiwan Strait will go on, and I think this will pave the way for a better understanding and also better cooperation and kind of even better conciliation in between the two sides. And thank you for your comment. And for Mr. Kim's question, I will try to make a response. I totally agree with you that the attitude of the Chinese leaders now are quite different if compared with the previous PRC's leaders. Well, I'll take an example. Well, actually, you can compare with the thought of Deng Xiaoping and the thought of Mao Zedong. There's a great apart. And we also could feel that the foreign policy as well as the Taiwan policy made by, for example, Hu Jintao, will be a little bit kind of different with that of Jiang Zemin. I would say that even the leaders in Beijing, they are trying to learn from the world. They are, they get themselves well trained. So I would say that more and more they will be pragmatic than ever before. As some kind of prediction says that in the year 2025, actually the PRC will overtake the United States as the #1 economy. Yes, of course, this might be possible. That don't forget, please, that even in China, the Beijing regime really has to deal with a lot of things, such as the how to curtail the inflation, and how to curtail the overheat economy, and how to deal with the continuous and tens of thousands the kind of social disorder. In each year, there are more than I would say that 20 or 25,000 kind of social disorder kind of incident happen in the mainland China, and I would say that the Chinese leaders will put more focus on domestic affairs rather than simply going out competing with the United States. So actually, I don't think we really have to worry that much. In other words, I would say there's a lot of things that the Beijing leaders should keep that simply will have to keep them in their mind, and I think they will have to deal with those kind of things. Well, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Rath, I think we have 2 questions.
Yes, I do. First of all, thank you both very much for your questions. First, you asked me about how does India plan to contain China's influence in South Asia, in particular with Pakistan. Unfortunately, India does not have a fully realized strategy in this regard. We've reacted piecemeal, specifically to specific incidents like the statement visa issue. But China's involvement in Pakistan is not something that India can actually contain, because these are two countries that have had extensive bilateral relations. What is more, like I said, given deteriorating relations between the US and Pakistan, it is increasingly looking towards China. Now, there has been some accusation from Pakistan that Indian agencies are involved in separatism in Balochistan, that they're actually actively sabotaging oil pipelines so that the dream of China receiving its oil through Gwadar port is not fully realized. This is somewhat half-baked, because the Balochistan separatist movement has its own funding, and it has its own bone of contention with the federal government. So I think thus far, India does not have a fully realized strategy. This may change, especially given China's interest in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. That is a much more direct strategic concern to New Delhi. So I think this is likely to change in the next few years, but right now India is choosing to react to specific incidents as opposed to revealing its overall strategy. With regard to SARC, I don't know that there is a concrete discussion between India and SARC countries on how to contend with the rise of China, simply because for many of the SARC countries, the rise of China is a good thing, because China has increasingly invested a lot of money in infrastructure, in trade ties in many of the SARC countries, including the ones that I have mentioned so far. So I don't think there is, and India does not also have the best relationship with many of the SARC countries, given that it is the regional dominant power in South Asia. It's very hard for many countries to have excellent relations with India, with the exception of 1 or 2. I think most of them have somewhat troubling relations with India. They're not overtly hostile like Pakistan, but many of them are not overtly friendly either. So the presence of China there is actually a good bargaining chip for many countries like Nepal, Bangladesh, given that if India is not willing to make a compromise or invest heavily in those countries, China is willing to do so. So I don't know that there has been a concrete discussion, but it is on the back of policymakers in New Delhi, I would think. So, thank you.
Thank you for your questions. How did the rise of China affect the security cooperation between Tokyo and Washington? And last 20 years, China issued one of the center for the discussion between Washington and Tokyo. For example, after Taiwan crisis, Taiwan missile crisis, Taiwan Strait in the year of 1995 and 6, Japan and China produced a joint security declaration in April 96. At the time, U.S.-Japan joint security declaration. But on the other hand, we don't just went to the road of the confrontation, but also joint declaration clearly share the concept of the engagement policy toward China. They use joint declaration introduce the term of engagement. Also, recent years we have cross consultations such as 2+2 talks. In February 2005, Japan and the United States also issued a joint statement. A joint statement revealed joint strategic objectives in this region. I think two or three is related to China. One is a welcome, show the welcome to the rise of China, or positive role of China in this region. But on the other hand, Taiwan issues. U.S. Japan said that we expect a peaceful resolution of Taiwan issues. So, and last 2 or 3 years, the main topics of the consultation between the Washington and Tokyo is that China's maritime strategy and naval activities, of course. So last April, Chinese naval fleet has got a very big size exercises in the Western Pacific. After that, in May last year, Japan and United States Defense Minister talks have got the consensus to have a more close cooperations in various fields, including the maritime issues and security. Also, close watch on China's maritime naval operations in this region. So I think that China issue in U.S.-Japan alliance of security strategic cooperation is the one always has got a central position in both terms, engagement terms and also hedging or checking or something. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Commentators, do you have anything to add? No? Okay, then let me wrap up the second session. The title was Rise of China and the Strategy of Neighboring Countries. And we discussed the neighboring countries' strategy to rise of China. The neighboring countries include Taiwan and India and Japan. And thank you very much for your excellent presentation and interesting comments. And also thank you, audience, and for your paying attention to the session. Thank you very much.